Just a note of thanks for so many greetings, well wishes. We have a countertop we use for displaying cards, and we could not fit them all. They were overflowing onto the floor. But most of all, thank you for your friendship, your love, your encouragement, especially for Karen. Turn in your Bibles to John's Gospel, chapter 18, verse 37. John 18, 37. Since 1868, each year at the end of May, our country has observed what we now call Memorial Day. At the end of May, flowers are blooming all across the country, and many of those flowers are brought to the graves of those who have laid down their lives in the service of our country. We have Veterans Day in November. That's for the honor of all those who serve our country, and that's a good thing. But Memorial Day was set aside for the honor of those who have given, in Lincoln's words, the last full measure of devotion, a gift for which we should be very thankful. When we studied John 15, we listened to Jesus as he taught the disciples what they needed to know in order to carry out his ministry on the earth after he has completed the work of redemption. He laid down this central principle. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you slaves, for the slave does not know what his master is doing. But I have called you friends, for all that I have heard from my Father I have made known to you. And now in chapter 18, we are watching Jesus blaze the trail of love, laying down his life, not just for his 11 closest friends, but for all who will come to know God through him. When we stopped last week, we saw Jesus standing before the official ruling authority in the land, Pontius Pilate, appointed by imperial conquering Rome to be the governor of the province of Judea. In our study through John's Gospel, we have observed what happened as people saw Jesus revealed as the Christ, the Anointed One, the deliverer who was promised back in the Garden of Eden, who will rescue human beings from the track of destruction that they have set out on. And not many received him that way. There was, for instance, a Galilean Jew named Philip, excitedly told his friend Nathanael, "We've found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, son of Joseph." Well, he had it almost right. But God promised the deliverer right after the fall of man, and he continued to promise his coming through the centuries of Old Testament revelation, giving his called out people a future to hope for. But when he finally came, not many received him that way. Well, as John says in his introduction, he was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own world, and his own people, descendants of Abraham, called out of this world for his purpose, did not receive him. What a sad situation. When Jesus came to Jerusalem just a week before this, and the road from Jericho takes a turn, and suddenly you can see the city of David laid out, Jesus burst into audible weeping, saying, "Would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace. But now they are hidden from your eyes. When this is over, only death and destruction awaits them." And Jesus wept. And now, just 1 week later, it's not just the Jewish leadership that's opposed to Jesus Christ, the deliverer. They've got the rest of the nations on their side. The world is against him. This is the fulfillment of messianic prophecy. In Psalm 2, why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, against his Christ, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. That's who Pilate represented. The nations who plot against God and his anointed. Acts 4 confirms that. The whole world is against Jesus, God's anointed. And Pilate was their voice and their tool. If you want the background on Pilate and how he got there and the circumstances that were driving his decisions, go to YouTube, call up last week's sermon, Judge on Trial. And we saw last week that Jesus graciously explained the reality to Pilate. And he concluded by saying, end of verse 37, for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. And Pilate was not listening. Now, he was doing his best. He was a responsible man with an important job, and he was trying to gather the facts so that he can make the right decision, but he was not understanding what Jesus was saying at all. People don't understand. Have you ever tried to tell someone about your faith in Christ and you did your best to convince them that they needed to trust Jesus too, but they did not get it, and nothing you said seemed to make any difference? That is the normal human condition. That's how people are. Twice in the Psalms we're told, the Lord looks down from heaven on the children of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one. That's the human condition. That's why it takes the power of God to save a soul. A miracle has to take place. But God does miracles. That's why you are here. If you're here because you love Jesus. I understand that not everybody who comes to church does. Well, Pilate was doing his best as a responsible civil servant, but he did not get it. He responded, verse 38, what is truth? And I have no idea how he said that. But I do know he did not even know that the answer to his question was standing right there. I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. All of Pilate's questions about truth would be answered if he only listened to and trusted Jesus. Only Jesus' handful of disciples have gotten that. And they have not gotten it very well. But they will. But the plan of redemption marches on. Unstoppable. Continuing verse 38. He went back outside and told the Jewish leaders his verdict. The only logical conclusion, I find no guilt in him. He desperately wants this problem to end. And the other gospel writers, we won't take time for all of the description, but they describe the various ways he tries to end this. But John cuts right to the next political solution. Politics will solve everything, right? You may laugh. But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you. And the you there, by the way, if you're reading Greek, anybody read Greek? Anyway, but I don't either, but I read books by guys who do. The you there is actually plural. We could translate it, you all. do you all want me to release to you the King of the Jews? He's appealing to the crowd. He knows what the leaders want. Well, Pilate's predecessors had started the practice of releasing a prisoner at Passover time in order to keep the crowds happy and quiet. The choice he gave them was Jesus or Barabbas. Now, Barabbas is described in the other Gospels as a notorious prisoner, an insurrectionist, and a murderer. So when John calls him a robber in verse 40, don't think of a petty think. Think terrorist. That's what he was. His name means son of a father. That sounds strange. Well, I think it's kind of like he's calling himself John Doe in order to protect his family. And some Jews went in for terrorism to oppose their Roman oppressors. Terrorism is scary stuff. We know that. And there probably were a number of people in the crowd who thought of him as a hero. And note how the political mind works. Pilate is looking for a way to have a plausible excuse to do what he knows is right and just release Jesus. And he remembers all those hosannas that were shouted on Sunday. You know, Jesus is popular with the crowd. Surely they won't risk the wrath of Caesar and ask for a terrorist. Surely they will ask for the obviously innocent man who's so popular. Surely with the right motivation, the crowd will choose what is right. Fat chance. Verse 40. They cried out again, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber, or as we would say today, a terrorist. Pilate underestimated the hatred of the Jewish leaders. Jesus is a threat to their power, and they will stop at nothing to destroy him. Matthew says the chief priests and elders, and even though they knew that they were risking angering Caesar, went through the crowd telling them to vote for Barabbas. Better to risk Caesar than Jesus. And the crowd really did not need all that much persuasion. You know, Jesus had been a big disappointment. You know, people today do come to church, give Jesus a try, and go away disappointed. So it was then. He did not meet their expectations. They wanted to make him king, remember back in chapter 6, and he would not let them. They were hoping after that big parade on Sunday that the war for Jewish liberation would start, and nothing happened. Same old, same old. Rome on top, us on the bottom. Yeah, Jesus is not working out. Let's vote Barabbas. Just a little thought here. Be careful about pushing patriotism. It can be good, but it's been used for much evil. Well, Pilate's scheme did not work. But Pilate, never at a loss for an idea, tries a new approach. He's going to work on the sympathy of the crowd. Going into chapter 19, we tend to chop our Bible reading into chapters. Chapters were invented by the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was not inspired. He didn't get the chapter divisions in the right places all the time. So, continuing the way John wrote it, then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. Now, we might have an image in our mind we've gotten from maybe a movie where we've seen somebody whipped. It was not like that. Chuck Swindoll, in describing this, shares facts from a forensic pathologist. Desperate to find a solution and reluctant to release Barabbas, Pilate hoped to satisfy the mob's bloodlust by sentencing Jesus to what was called the halfway death. John's simple statement, Pilate then took Jesus and flogged him, is shockingly plain. Jesus was led to the Roman garrison adjacent to the temple and given over to an expert in torture called the lictor. who used a whip with long leather tails called a flagrum. The leather straps could be merely knotted, or if the lictor wanted to inflict more damage, he could choose a whip with small metal weights or even pieces of sheep bone braided into the straps. The iron balls would cause deep contusions, and the leather thongs and sheep bones would cut into the skin and subcutaneous tissues. Then as the flogging continued, the lacerations would tear into the underlying skeletal muscles and produce quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh. The scourging typically resulted in rib fractures and severe lung bruises and lacerations with bleeding into the chest cavity and partial or even complete collapse of the lung. The lictor was an expert in the art of torture and knew exactly how to beat a man to within an inch of his life. Swindoll's description ends there. History records that many, as you can imagine, did not survive. It's hard to think of it. And maybe that's one reason why John keeps his description so short. It's just hard to think of it all again. Matthew, Mark, and Luke had already written down so many painful details. I suspect that John's manuscript had tear stains on it. Jesus surrendered to that for us, the just for the unjust. That's not even getting to the cross. But then John adds this detail of what Jesus suffered. Verse 2. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and struck him with their hands. Just a sidelight. They crowned him with thorns. I think it's instructive that thorns came in with sin. Genesis 3:18. Just think, roses, but no thorns. But since man sinned in Adam, all the roses of life have thorns. And some of those thorns are killers. God cursed creation. All the roses have thorns, at least all the ones people haven't messed with. And even the newfangled ones fade away so quick your money seems wasted. But Jesus came to bear that curse, to suffer in order to take away its pain. Not only the curse that lies on people and everything they try to accomplish, but on nature itself. That's what Paul says in Romans chapter 8. Against its will, all creation was subjected to God's curse. But with eager hope, creation looks forward to the day when it will join God's children in glorious freedom from death and decay. No more thorns. But with thorns, they mocked him. A crown of pain, a purple robe, like Caesar. They were having a good time. The verb tense indicates that they kept marching up. Probably everybody filing past him. And as they filed past, they raised a hand and salute, "Hail, King of the Jews," like, "Hail, Caesar." And in the expanded translation, they kept striking him in the face with their hands. In effect, Pilate set the soldiers loose with the understanding, "Have fun, boys." Soldiers, like all people you rule over, have to be humored. That's one of the rules of leadership. You have to learn how to humor people. Soldiers have always acted like this. Why? They're human beings. When human beings are let loose with no controls, they act like this. That's why God's institution of human government is so important. According to Paul in Romans 13, it keeps people from doing the things that come naturally to sinners. And soldiers let loose without controls are like ordinary people on steroids. when government does not restrain the forces of hell go on a rampage. We might say, well, yeah, so that was back then. Soldiers don't act like that now. Oh, yeah? Have you read any recent war history? Soldiers have always, and still today, act like this. Soldiers, like all people you rule over, have to be humored to be controlled. People love mocking humor, don't they? Only now they're mocking God. The truth about the human heart is on vivid, sickening display. They're mocking God who put himself in their hands because he loved them. Where was Pilate while this was going on? He was inside his house, getting away from this for a little while, get away from the unpleasantness. But you cannot get away from God. No one can. Remarkably, Pilate tries again to do the right thing. Verse 4. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man. Look at him," he says. "Humiliated, shockingly injured. Isn't that enough?" No, it's not. It's not enough. Verse 6, with the chief priests and the officers, remember who they were? They're the ones who led God's people in worship. They were the ones the most hardened. When the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" And Pilate has had all he can take of these guys. Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. Go ahead, defy Rome. See what happens to you." Pilate hates these people, and they have earned his hatred. But they hold the last card, and it takes Pilate by surprise. Verse 7, the Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die, because he has made himself out to be the Son of God." Do you realize that's why John is writing this book? To prove that Jesus is the Son of God? That's what Jesus has been proving all through his public ministry. John will close this by saying, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." They saw the miracles, they saw the proof, but they would not trust him. To be the Son of God, all that meant to them was, hey, we've got an excuse to get him executed. And that was their last card. They're about to win the game. You see, Son of God was one of the titles of Caesar. When Julius Caesar came to power, he's the first one, he was invested with that title, Son of God. That is very handy if you want dictatorial powers. And all of the Caesars is a family name, so all the other rulers after him who took power, they claimed that name. All the other Caesars took that same title, Son of God. Verse 8, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. Oh no, what am I going to do now? I thought he was just a harmless lunatic, and they say he's been calling himself by Caesar's title. He's probably still just a lunatic, but if I don't handle this right, it's curtains. What am I going to do? Verse 9, he's racking his brains when he says, He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. He's already found out Jesus is from Galilee, but he's so desperate, he just asks again. People do that when they're all out of ideas. But Jesus gave him no answer. Why would he, when he's already told him that his kingdom is not from this world? There's nothing to say. And Pilate wouldn't listen anyway. He was oppressed and treated harshly, yet he never said a word. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as the sheep is silent before the shearers, he did not open his mouth. Verse 10, so Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" It's a little more arrogant if you're reading it in Greek. It's the me comes first there. To me you do not speak? How dare you? Well, Pilate is between a rock and a hard place, and there's nothing he can do. The great politician has been outmaneuvered, and, well, fear makes people angry. And by the way, getting mad never helps. You've noticed that, at least in other people. And look at verse 11. Jesus is so gracious to Pilate. He's actually giving him some assurance, not the blessed assurance we sang about earlier, but it's real assurance. Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." Why is Pilate in charge? God put him there. God put an ignorant Gentile in charge. But there's someone else in charge under him who is not ignorant. Caiaphas and all the Jewish leaders under him. Pilate chose power over truth. But the Jewish leaders had the truth. They memorized scripture, they studied prophecy, and they still plotted with all the cunning they could muster to execute their own Messiah. Pilate is in big trouble, but at least he won't have to account for that. Jesus, the judge, is gracious. Verse 12. Frantically searching. From then on, Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." Now, they'd already played that card, but they kind of say to him, "Look at the card on the table, Governor. You lost. Throw in your hand." Pilate had to choose. Tiberius or Jesus? Kingdom of earth or heaven? Power or truth? So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha. The world in the authority of power speaks. Verse 14. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. Time to get the Passover sacrifices rolling. He said to the Jews, and I think his voice is dripping with resentment and ridicule, "Behold your king." They cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." They forgot someone. the King of the universe, and they will suffer for it. And then John writes the terrible words. So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. Whew. Aren't you glad that out of this, Jesus saves? Let's quietly worship.